Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
Thanks, Brad. As a business and healthcare law firm, a client call is usually a request for help. But sometimes clients don't recognize they even need help. Instead, it is often too late when they finally make the call. Today's story is one of those examples where the client trusted one of his business partners and best friends growing up and just didn't think he needed to call anyone for help.
Yeah, often, Michael, we call this the 550 rule. We've discussed this in other episodes, but if you're not familiar with the 550 rule, the concept is, you're going to have to, when you're starting something out, sometimes you need help. And either you're going to pay someone $5 up front to do it right or $50 in the back end to fix it. But, Michael, I want to shift a little bit here. I would like to know, do you trust me?
B.
No, there was not an A or B question.
Oh.
The question is, do you trust me or a stranger?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, of course I trust you. You're one of my closest friends, and we've been partners for 15 plus years. Why are you asking?
All right. So go back with the concept is you trust me over a stranger because the whole stranger danger thing, right? So for our listeners that have worked with us or met us in person, they know us. But for everyone else, we're just some voice in their head, hopefully saying nice things to them. And so for our audience that doesn't know this, I thought today we could share some more personal facts and for our audience so they can have more of a trust factor with us. And I know that in season 1, we had our premiere where we talked a lot about who we were and why we started the podcast. But today I thought we could just have some fun facts. So, Michael, what is your favorite one-hit wonder song from the 90s and why?
Well, I don't know how this builds trust. In fact, it may do the opposite, but it will definitely reveal my poor taste when I was in my 20s. The first song that popped to my mind is What's Up by the Four Non-Blondes. I remember listening to this song during the angsty season of life called my 20s plus law school. What about you?
I'm hoping that our audience is not tuned out when they hear that one, but mine's probably not much better. There's a band called Chumbawamba, Tub Thumping, but most people know it as I Get Knocked Down. And that song was on one day when I was driving back from studying all day for the Louisiana bar, and it kind of kicked me to the next gear to keep studying, and it became my rally song throughout that process when I was studying. So let's have one more question. What's your favorite pizza?
Okay, I can kind of regain some credibility here. New York style pepperoni.
All right. Well, my favorite is basically any kind of pizza, but if I'm going to go with my very, very favorite, my cousin makes homemade pizza, and he puts bacon, potatoes, onions, green chives, and cheese on it. It's amazing. The pizza dough and the sauce is all homemade. It is some good eating.
You know, I'm one of those people that will inadvertently start oversharing. Before we go there, are there any other personal questions?
No, not today. We're not going to have any more personal questions. But, speaking of pizza, as you know, kids do love it. And at my children's school, every Friday, fathers could volunteer to serve pizza for lunch. Yes, this is pre-COVID world. And so, we would get to show up and hand out cheese and pepperoni pizza, and we were the rock stars of the school. But that one of these random Pizza Fridays is the genesis of today's story.
Well, jump in. I want to hear it.
So in this story, I was handing out pizza at the school with a couple other fathers. After the kids headed back to their classrooms, we started cleaning up, and we started having that typical small talk, as to who does what kind of thing. And one of the dads noticed I was wearing a suit and said, well, what type of profession? What do I do? And after I gave him the quick elevator speech about being a business and healthcare attorney, he kind of stops me and says, can I ask you a quick question?
Famous last words. Anyone who's practiced long enough knows that there's no such thing as a quick question in those circumstances.
No, it never is, and that's exactly what happened here. So over the next 45 minutes, he shared this story with me. And so for today, we're going to call him Mr. Workhorse.
Okay, explain, Mr. Workhorse.
So Mr. Workhorse was a young self-made individual who had been working for years for a very large company. He was their number one best salesperson, did a ton of travel, and he was their company go-to guy on any of these major projects. But still, was not seeing any financial rewards for his success.
Okay, I get it. I see why you are calling him Mr. Workhorse.
So when he learned his wife was pregnant with their first child, he didn't think he could keep up this pace of these long hours and travel, and just the pay was just too low. So one night he was hanging out with his best friend, who actually happened to be his best man in the wedding, and over a few beers he started to share his concerns with his current career path.
Yeah, who has not had that conversation at some point in their life?
Exactly. And in this conversation, Mr. Workhorse tells his best friend that he has this idea of how to develop a new business based on all this knowledge that he has, and hopefully helping himself make more money and putting himself in a better position when his first child is born. So his best friend, who we'll call Mr. Crawfish, tells him he wants to help start this business.
Brad, I know you're from New Orleans, but why crawfish?
Okay, so growing up in New Orleans, we had this saying that if someone backstabbed you or went around your back, they crawfished you. And yes, Michael, that is different than the term catfishing someone. So it's not a catfish, it's a crawfish.
Okay, well, a little Cajun flair. Mr. Crawfish works. I hope there's not a Mr. King Cake in the story.
No, there's no Mr. King Cake in this story, but I think I like that for another one. Well, as Mr. Workhorse planned out this new business model, Mr. Crawfish says that maybe they should bring Mr. Crawfish's brother in on this deal because he's good with helping with legal and accounting.
Crawbro, was he a lawyer or CPA?
No, but he did work in a very large accounting department for a very large company and apparently knew how to use LegalZoom.
So he stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night.
Exactly. So the brother, who we'll call Mr. Weasel, helped form the limited liability company, filed all the paperwork to launch this new company.
I don't think you need to explain why we're calling him Mr. Weasel.
No, it's going to come apparent real quick. So Mr. Workhorse gives notice and leaves his current employer and ventures out to build his own company. For the first few months, he's actually not taking any income, but he's betting on the fact that he has this great business idea, great business relationships, and he's going to build something. So he keeps these same crazy hours, but knows ultimately, at the very end, it's for his own benefit. Mr. Crawfish and Mr. Weasel are helping him kind of, but they both have full-time jobs, so they're only giving him a few hours of input here and there.
So he's hard at work building up his company this time.
Yeah, one would think that is a correct statement, Michael. That's a good observation so far. But let's fast forward a few years later. It's about almost 2 years later. Mr. Weasel has been releasing small draws from the company to Mr. Workhorse to help offset the cost of running the business. The company has seen a large number of new clients, and Mr. Workhorse feels so confident enough that he's actually going to go try to buy himself a new house, obviously with a child and one child already. So while he's gathering all his information for the new home, the bank starts asking him for all his current employer, copies of his tax returns, and a list of all his assets.
Fairly standard stuff.
Right. Same stuff that everyone would get when they're going to give the bank their underwear drawer moment, right? So Mr. Workhorse notes that he's the founder of this company and he owns 80% of it. The bank asked him for some additional paperwork, and Mr. Workhorse taxes notes that he's never received a distribution from the company to date.
Well, I thought you said he'd been an owner for 2 years. He didn't have a K-1 from his company?
No, he didn't. In fact, he actually never even asked why he didn't have one, because he was a first-time owner and didn't realize he should be receiving a K-1 from the company. And maybe, Michael, maybe for our audience, we have our vocabulary word of the day. What is a K-1?
K-1 is a reference to Schedule K-1 on the IRS Form 1065. For businesses that operate as partnerships, it reflects the partner's share of the partnership income, deductions, credits, etc.
So, tax stuff.
Yes.
So Mr. Workhorse had, again, never been part of any ownership, and so he or understood how corporate taxes were paid as an owner, and as such, he didn't even know he should have been receiving a K-1. Additionally, when he asked for proof of ownership from Mr. Weasel, at first, Mr. Weasel was like, oh, yeah, I got to get that from my lawyers, and this kind of confused Mr. Workhorse because he just needed the paperwork to give to the bank, so he started calling his good friend, Mr. Crawfish. And finally, the big bomb was dropped. Mr. Weasel had formed the entity, like he said he would, via LegalZoom, and made himself the sole manager, and then basically eventually made he and his brother, Mr. Crawfish, as the only owners.
Oh, wow.
So Mr. Workhorse had no ownership, They had been treating him as a W-2 employee, and worse, he later learns through litigation, basically, that Mr. Weasel and Mr. Crawfish had been paying themselves a salary and running, I'm doing air quotes here, business expenses through the company.
Wow. That's a crazy story. And yeah, they have full-time jobs, so I just can imagine what their, quote, business expenses were.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's go into a commercial. And on the other side, Brad and I will spend some additional time discussing what happened to Mr. Workhorse. And we'll bring in one of our friends and colleagues here from ByrdAdatto to help talk through it.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd. Now, Michael, this season, the theme is, when should I ask for help? So for the second half of the show, we are joined by our friend and colleague, Robert Fisher, to help us break down today's story. Michael, please introduce Robert.
Robert is an associate here at ByrdAdatto. He's from Dallas, married to his wife, Taylor. He is obviously in our Dallas office. His undergrad is at the University of Georgia, and usually you can see some evidence of that if you're around him. He went to law school at SMU in Dallas, 2 kids and a dog named Shocker, Georgia. And he was actually our first law clerk when we started ByrdAdatto and the first associate we hired out of SMU Law School. Robert, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Got to rep the undergrad however I can.
Yes, for the audience, just to let you know, before we started, Robert and I were having an entire conversation about Georgia football. So if you want to see a grown man cry, and Robert's a big man, it's just talking about Georgia football. But let's get in today, Robert. Robert, understanding how to form an actual entity is not second nature for most people, and much less a lot of attorneys. So in this story, we have this first-time entrepreneur who unfortunately trusted his friends, in this case his best man, to form his business. And for those who don't know the actual process of how you form a business, and let's stick with this today's story, how do we initially form a limited liability company?
Sure. And I think a big piece of it is that you got to understand the terminology that the Secretary of State uses and whatnot. And you want to make sure that you're actually filing the document that is doing what you want it to do. I know one of the big things that I've always heard is that people think that filing a DBA or doing business as name is forming an entity, and it's not. That's just basically filing an alias or an AKA or a nickname. And so if you haven't actually gone through the process of registering the entity, forming the entity with the state, then you're not really protected. So the big thing and the first step is you've got to file the certificate of formation. That's what we call it in Texas. You can see it called other things in other states, which I think I can get into that a little bit more in a second. But for a Texas LLC, you're going to file a certificate of formation, and that is what breathes life into the lungs of your entity, and you have a LLC, a separate entity that you can run business out of that provides the liability protection and all the things that you form a business for to isolate yourself individually from the business. And from there's a series of steps and documents that you need to have that the Secretary of State's concerned about the certificate of formation. And so you kind of got to get a little bit deeper into the, Texas Business Organizations Code or whatever your state's code is to really find out the documents you need to shore up the border around your entity and make sure it's doing what it needs to do. Typically the next step after you actually form it would be to get the EIN from the IRS, which is, we typically try to say that's the entity's social security number. You also hear it called a tax ID number. And that number is going to be the permanent number assigned to your entity, which you need for opening bank accounts and filing your taxes and tracking all of those data points where, just like your social security number goes with you for life, your EIN typically goes with your entity for life and is, the business side's social. And then depending on which state you're in, you're going to want to, prepare consents. And these are documents that aren't necessarily going to be filed with anybody, but you're going to want these organizational consents on record in your internal documents that shows the paper trail that the proper people have approved this entity to be formed. And, you've started to delegate powers as to who can do what and really start narrowing down the scope of what each person is going to do within the entity, especially when it's a multi-person entity like our story. If it's just yourself, that's one thing. There's still some reasons to divide the roles even within yourself, and when it's a multi-member though, it's really important to start telling people, hey, you can do this, I can do that. And that way you don't get these situations where somebody has taken ownership for it from you and you don't even know it. And the big, granddaddy document that you're going to want, especially with a multi-member LLC, is going to be the company agreement, the governing document that outlines from start to finish who can do what, how tax distributions are going to be made, how, we call it succession planning. If somebody was to die or somebody was to commit fraud or, all of those kind of worst case scenario situations, and you get it all in writing so that you have your plans laid out. Everybody's on the same footing. You know what the plan is moving forward. The way most states are set up is that there's in Texas, we have the Texas Business Organizations Code, which gives the kind of the default rules for how, if you didn't have something in writing, this is what you would follow. Similar to if you died without a will, there's the default rules of what would happen. This entity, if you don't have a company agreement in place, you go to the TBOC or whatever your state's code is. And those rules aren't always going to be what you want. And the beauty of an LLC or any entity is that you can create to the vast majority of situations, you can create it to do and function however you want. And so it's just really important to spend the time, and company agreements can be long and tedious and people don't want to, get into the nitty gritty details, but it's just really, really important to get everything set up on the front end. Just like, your 550 rule, like you were talking about, Brad, where, if you don't spend the time doing this on the front end, it's going to cost you on the back end, because it's a lot harder to fix things after they've gone wrong than putting the rules in place ahead of time.
Yeah. And it becomes obviously even more important the more owners you have, because your risk skyrockets if you don't have that all worked out. And in many states, for those that are not in Texas, it's called the company agreement, is also called the operating agreement. But that begs the question, Robert, does it make a difference as to where you form the LLC?
I think it does, absolutely. And it's kind of a multi-factor test different, not necessarily a test, but different factors that you want to take into consideration. First off being, where is your company going to be operating? Where are your employees? Where are you doing business from? Because, a lot of people hear Delaware is that's the flag bearer, where it's got this great corporate code and CPAs, and especially if you're a big company that wants to go public, the international world loves Delaware law. But if you're kind of running just your own little entity in your world, Delaware may not make sense for you, because I have yet to meet somebody who lives in Delaware, but I'm sure there are people out there.
It's on the map. We know that much, right?
It is there. So with that, I think that's what people forget, is that you form in Delaware, but if you're in Texas and all your employees are in Texas, then you got to register as a foreign entity in Texas. You're going to be a Delaware LLC doing business in Texas. And, the little extra money you're spending on filing fees and having to do tax filings in multiple states, it may not work out for you. So, it's just a consideration there. And then, the individual state's taxes, franchise taxes, and how one state handles it better than others, or might have a little bit more advantageous tax structuring is a consideration. And it's important also when you're doing your documents that you understand what state you're in, because each state uses a little bit different terminology. I kind of mentioned it a second ago. We call it certificate of formation. California calls it the articles of incorporation. You might have the articles of organization, the certificate of organization or incorporation. It's these interchangeable terms. And so you want to make sure that your documents reflect the exact terminology that your state that you formed your entity in and whose law you're following. It all needs to line up. And that's where, using just pulling documents off the internet, these formation documents are not one size fits all. That's for sure.
And that's a great point. And you're using, and so now our audience knows that there's a whole bunch of steps that you go through to form it, understanding that there are different terms depending on your state. So in the story, I used a couple of terms, and I want to get back to it. So Mr. Weasel was the sole manager, and he and his brother were the sole members. And for our audience, maybe you can at least distinguish in Texas and other states, what does that term mean, manager and member of an LLC?
Absolutely. A member is going to be the owner. That would be the shareholder in a corporation. So in an LLC, we call it the members, and those are the owners. Those are the people that are going to be receiving distributions, the profits of the company, and have the ownership stake. A manager is a person more like the board of directors in a corporation. The managers are running the day-to-day operations. They can be a member, or they could just be somebody you bring in to be the manager. And that's where that operating agreement, company agreement that I've been talking about, that's going to be the document that distinguishes the power between those two positions. And it's important, even if you are a single member LLC, that you have those roles divided. If you're going to be a manager managed LLC, which we typically recommend, is that there is that wall that divides those. So even though you're the same person, it's important to remember that you're going to be wearing a different hat when you're making decisions as a member as opposed to making decisions as a manager. And there's your fiduciary duties, who you are representing, and the consequences of those actions. It does matter from a technical legal standpoint as to which hat you're wearing when you make those. And so
that's a good point. And I want to jump on that real quick. For our audience understanding is that you could have a hat on as a member, right? As Robert just said, which means you're an owner. And you could also have a hat on as the manager. So it's just different hats, and you wear them at different times.
Yeah, and I'll just say too, we mentioned earlier, Robert, that the company was taxed as a partnership in the story. Now, none of us are tax attorneys, so I think we can do kind of a real quick summary. But can you kind of give a kind of explanation on what the choices are when you're an LLC on how it can be taxed?
The LLCs are another benefit of the LLC is that it's very flexible. It allows you to be taxed in several different ways. And the first step is just how many members you have. If you're a single member LLC, then your options are to be a disregarded entity, or you could elect, which is going to be the default the IRS assigns you, or you could elect to be taxed as an Escort. A partnership is going to be the default for a multi-member LLC, and you could also elect to be, taxed as an S corp or a C corp if you wanted to. A partnership is just kind of that default tax setting for a multi-member LLC, and so you would be. While the LLC itself is not a partnership in the sense of the structure of it, it can be taxed as a partnership in the eyes of the IRS. And so you'd follow that partnership tax law, which brings up the K-1s and everything that we discussed in the story.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And so a lot of times, as you're explaining, there's a difference from a tax perspective in an LLC. And so for our audience, Robert, we get this question a lot. Maybe the audience is like, I'm trying to remember what I am. Am I an LLC or an S corp? Well, what's the difference between an LLC and an S corp?
An LLC is going to be the legal structure that you have filed as in your state. So I have formed a limited liability company. S corp is a tax status. People might throw S corp around, which you've elected to with the IRS. People want to throw the S corp around. If you're a corporation that is taxed as an S corp, that's one thing. An LLC that is taxed as an S corp is a different. So for sure, don't just say that you're an S corp. You are an LLC that is taxed as an S corp.
Wow. Okay. Well, we could probably do an entire episode with one of our tax buddies to start breaking that down, but we would have 0 listeners at the end. So, Brad, what happened to Mr. Workhorse?
Well, unfortunately, he had to hire litigation counsel and quickly learned that he was in a tough spot. He had no documents to prove that he was an owner. The LLC had 2 years of tax returns, which did not list him as an owner. And he didn't have any significant documentation except the fact that he was listed as a W-2, employee, a tax term, a W-2 employee. So he was just treated just as any other employee of the entity. And unfortunately, after spending some good money trying to chase this with this litigation counsel, he realized he really didn't have any options but to either go back to his old employer, find a new employer, or start all over again.
Man, that sounds awful.
Yeah, it was terrible. And, after he told me this story, I gave him some additional thoughts and we kind of strategized a few other things. But eventually he headed back to work. We walked off. We were walking down the corridor together, and he was holding his cold pizza in his hands. And it was just awful because he had tears going down his eyes as he was leaving. I felt horrible for him. I wish he had spoken with an attorney when this all started. And Michael, this is why we started this podcast, is going back to the theme this time is, when should I ask for help?
Well, and the answer always tends to be the same, on the front end. I mean, Mr. Workhorse should have, called an attorney when he was getting this set up to make sure that, it was as he thought it was, not just because he, should have suspected his best friend would screw him over, but just to get the business set up correctly. And, what comes to mind when I hear this story and we connect it to the 550 rule is a lot of times the only option you have if you're on the 50 side of things is litigation. And, for a small business, litigation is not very viable. I mean, when we were doing our show prep, all of us got so mad just talking about this story again, because you're just thinking about how this guy got completely screwed and he had no access to justice. He couldn't afford to fight the fight in a civil court context. And so he got pushed basically, into killing his dream and going back into, the workforce, so to speak.
Yep. Well, on that positive note, join us next Wednesday when we have a special guest, the founder of Synergy Metaesthetics, Nicole Chiaramante. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.